The sexual marketplace is always changing and evolving, and we have access to some new data that shows some fascinating trends. Check out this graph. What you're looking at here are the number of sexual partners that someone in their 20s has had. And you can see here that most people in their 20s, both men and women, have had between 2 and 4 sexual partners. But there's also strong figures for just having 1 sexual partner or between 5 and 10. So if you're in your 20s and you're a man and you've had somewhere between like 2 and 10 sexual partners, that's pretty normal. But one of the things I really like about this graph is how it shows how things have changed over the decades. You can see here that in the 90s, 11% of young men were virgins. In the 2000s, it was just 9%, but in the 20-teens, that has jumped up to 15%. That's about a 40% increase in male virginity from the last decade. That's a huge jump up, and my prediction is that it's only going to get higher. Check out my video if you haven't seen it yet on the 10 reasons why young men are having less sex than they ever have before. I'll put a link to that down below. But this graph also gives really fascinating data on women, which I think is sorely needed because a lot of men who visit the manosphere, I'm worried that they're leaving with the impression that most women are hugely promiscuous and just slutting it up every single weekend with new partners. The data doesn't really bear that out. So let me ask you this question. What would you consider slutty for a woman in her 20s? Like, what's a number that you'd be like, whoa, that's really promiscuous? Is it 10 plus? Would you say that a woman in her 20s who slept with 10 or more guys is really promiscuous? Okay, if that's your number, that's fine. But let me tell you that the number of women that are that slutty is pretty rare. If you add this group to this group and this group, it actually only adds up to 10%, which means that 90% of women in their 20s have had less than 10 partners and are not very slutty by your own definition. Even if you add in the figures of the women who've had between 5 and 10 partners, which maybe you consider like partly slutty, that still only adds 20%, which brings the total up to 30%. That's still the majority, 70% of women who are not sluts. I know emotionally that can be hard if there's like a girl that you've had one-itis for and you've idolized her, but she's never given you the time of day and she's busy sleeping around with every guy that's not you. Emotionally, it can feel like all women are total sluts, but the data just doesn't really reflect that. When you look at the statistics, we're not really in some huge slutty epidemic, except in one area that's pretty interesting. You just zoom in right there because you can see that at the top end, there is actually an explosion in really super duper slutty women that's never really happened before. You can see that the big numbers, like the people who've slept with 50 plus people, that still mostly belongs to men. But in the previous decades, really slutty women didn't really register statistically, but they do now. It looks like there's like a 500% increase or something. Even on those lesser numbers like the 11 to 20 demographic or the 21 to 50 demographic, you can see that over the decades, there's a gentle trend upwards from women. Right now, it's still the minority of women, so we'll have to keep watching this space to see if this trend continues or if it stops or if it even reverses itself. But one thing that I find really interesting about this graph is that you can see that just like in so many areas in life, women find themselves at the top of the bell curve while men find themselves more at the extremes. Which gender is more likely to have 1 partner or 0 partners? It's men. But men are also the ones more likely to have a large number of partners. In the sexual marketplace, men exist at the extremes, whereas women occupy the center. You actually find that to be true of men and women in lots of areas of life. I'll get back to the graph in just a moment, but consider something like wealth. Like you probably noticed that the wealthiest people on the planet, the richest, the most successful, often tend to be men, but also the most broke, like the most number of like homeless people also seems to be men. You can also find this with intelligence, with the guys with like the really crazy genius, like super intelligence IQ, they tend to be men, but also the guys with really low IQ happen to be men. Why do men tend to exist at both ends of the spectrum? Well, there's actually an important evolutionary reason for this. It's called the variability hypothesis, and I'm going to quickly explain what that is because it's going to make so many things make sense to you once you understand this. So understand this, that historically speaking, women were a lot more likely to reproduce than men. 4 out of 5 women have passed on their genes throughout history, whereas that's only 2 out of 5 men. When your chance of reproducing as a biological woman is so high, you can understand why evolution is a little bit more conservative in the gene distribution. Like, okay, we don't need to take crazy risks here. We're throwing genes together to create a woman, but we're pretty sure she's going to reproduce because most women do. So we're not going to go too out there. We're going to play this one quite modestly. Just make her something of a typical woman, and I'm pretty certain she's going to be successful. That's not the case for men. Historically, only 2 out of 5 men ever reproduced. And so if you want to be one of those top guys, you want to be the winner, you can't just be average. You can't afford to play it safe. You got to try something. You got to get noticed. Evolution was not conservative with the gene distribution of men. It couldn't afford to be. Evolution couldn't play it safe with men, and that's what the variability hypothesis is. It's sometimes called the greater male variability hypothesis, and it's the notion that you tend to find a greater variety of traits inside men than you do in women. Women can play it safe, be boring, just like, oh yeah, here are these genes, you'll probably reproduce. But for men, it's like, oh my God, 60% of men never get chosen to reproduce. They never find partners. Okay, we got to try something big. We got to get noticed. So yeah, add in some of these genes, add in some of those genes. Like, who knows? It might be a huge disaster, but it could also be a crazy success. As a man, it's worth the risk. It's go big or go home as a man. That's why so many guys end up on both ends of the bell curve. Genetically speaking, as a man, you are the experimental gender. It's not an accident that men end up at the extremes. We're actually designed biologically to either be big winners or big losers. And you can see that in this graph. There's a huge percentage of men who've only had one partner or even zero, and there's a small percentage of men at the top who are having a huge amount of success. I did the maths on this graph, and it's pretty fascinating or depressing, depending on where you sit on the bell curve. But look, if you calculate all these 3 groups here, this equals 57%. And they've slept with 90 women in total. So between them, that 57% of men have had 90 women, 90 sexual partners in their 20s. Now that 2.5% of men that you see at the top, assuming that 50 plus means that it might be some of them having 50, some of them having like 200. So we'll just simplify and say like 75 on average. That 2.5% of men have slept with 187 women between them. I really think that gets across the point that I'm trying to make here, because you can see that the top 2.5% of men have had twice the number of sexual partners as the bottom 57%. Now, luckily for you, as a man, your life is not going to be limited by genetic determinism. You can take action as an individual to improve things in your life, and watching this channel is a really important step because you're increasing your understanding of masculinity, of femininity, of the dynamics between men and women, of the psychology of dating and relationships and sexuality. That knowledge gives you a really important edge. I assume that's the motivation for why most people are watching these videos, why people sign up for my Patreon for the more nuanced stuff, why people do my paid course, because they're trying to understand this stuff better so that they can improve things for themselves, and it'll work. I get messages all the time from people who say that watching this content has helped them become more successful in their dating life and in their relationships. But it's not just about knowledge. You can do stuff like looks maxing, good clothes, good grooming, going to the gym, getting a good body and muscles. You can make yourself more successful, earn more money, become a player in the world. That's one of the things I like most about being a man, is that you have a much bigger capacity than I think a woman does to control your own destiny, to shape life the way that you want it to be. So hopefully you find that message optimistic and empowering. I know I certainly did. But I want to finish the video with just a couple of disclaimers, because I think I might have casually mentioned a few times like those guys who are sleeping with lots of women. I referred to them as like the top percentage of men, or like the top men. I don't mean to imply that I link the quality of a man with the number of women that he has slept with. I'm not personally a fan of male promiscuity when it's in like crazy exaggerated kind of forms, and I actually think that guys who feel the need to sleep around that much have got some psychological stuff they should work through. So I just wanted to mention that in case my video was coming across as like me being pro like sexual conquest for men, as though that makes you a better man. No, that's not what I'm trying to get across. That's not what I believe. And I also want to acknowledge that all of this data is from the General Social Survey, which as far as I know is based on people honestly self-reporting. And there's always people in the comment section who like love to virtue signal like, oh, you can't trust, you know, that kind of methodology in research, just asking people to tell the truth. That's not true science. Like, I hear you, I've heard it before, and part of me even agrees with you. Like, there's some legitimacy to that point of view. So if as a principled stand out of like academic purity, you want to throw away everything that's in this video, you're like, no, you can't trust anything that it says, that's fine. That doesn't bother me. The only thing I'll ask is that you're consistent, right? Like if you have an emotional investment in the story that all women are massive sluts nuts or whatever, and that's why you're throwing out this research, that's not really a good reason. I would say that you need to be consistent across the board and not listen to any social surveys on any topic. Even if they perfectly conform to your views and your beliefs, you'd be a hypocrite if you were to say that those ones are legitimate and this one's not. So you can bleed these statistics, or you can say that it's all nonsense. I don't really mind so long as you're consistent. Have you ever heard of the concept of personalization? It comes from cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's referring to the notion that we tend to make neutral events personal to us. It's a particular kind of mind virus where we make ourselves miserable by kind of assuming that the world and people are out to get us and it's all unique to us. Everybody does this to a certain extent, but they're not often conscious of it. Like, a lot of things feel personal to us, particularly in our romantic relationships, when actually they're not. If what I'm saying is resonating with you and you're like, ooh, yes, I do that, and I don't like that I do that, I want to work on that, then you're going to get a lot of value out of my latest Patreon video, because it's on the topic of personalization. We go into a lot of depth, a lot of discussion. Patreon's where I tend to post my more in-depth, nuanced kind of topics. You know, the sort of stuff that doesn't really appeal to like the YouTube algorithm, but for the people who are really dedicated to understanding this stuff at a deep level, you're going to love the Patreon content. Some guys don't realize that for every video I post here on YouTube, I post an additional bonus video on my Patreon, which means that at the moment, you're only seeing half of my total content. If you'd like to see the other half, then just head over to my Patreon. Or if you're looking for some personal advice, like in your dating life or in your relationships, and you want my input, then hit me up on Hey Hero, tell me exactly what's going on for you, and I'll create a personalized video just for you. Or if you're looking for something a lot meatier that you really want to sink your teeth into, understand it thoroughly, and maybe even test yourself, then check out my paid course, 100 Sides of Women. That features 10 real stories, 10 questions in each for 100 total. There's 6.5 hours of video footage, so it takes, I don't know, at least a couple of days for you to get through. It's really the best thing I've ever created. It's so in-depth. The reviews have been phenomenally positive. People who buy it, who do it, just speak its praises. There's actually a free trial. One of the videos you can do completely for free. Check out the video down below that explains how you can access that and explains the whole course.